Well, I'm really excited actually to see how many people are on this call. It's really great that so many of you are interested in nightjars and possibly doing one of these surveys. We're really excited this year. You know, last year it was really this last minute effort where, you know, DEC asked us, you know, the Atlas to step in and try to fill in the gaps while they basically weren't allowed to go do their normal surveys because of the COVID pandemic. And we did so well last year that now they want us to take over and have it be a completely volunteer run project. And so Matt Palumbo at the DEC and I have been working on trying to expand what DEC has done historically and make it a little bit more volunteer friendly and expand it to the rest of the state. And yeah, hopefully provide quite a bit more information for the Atlas than we would normally. You know, trying to account for the fact, like if we have people going out and doing these nightjar surveys at dusk or at night, then there's a lot of other species that are traditionally not very well covered by breeding bird atlases because people aren't out birding at those times usually. And so if we have people going out and doing these surveys anyways, they can help us fill in some of the gaps for those sorts of crepuscular and nocturnal species too. Yeah, I think everyone knows me at this point, but Matt, maybe you want to do a brief intro and then take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Julie. I really appreciate it. And again, apologize for the late start. Hopefully we don't go too much over due to that, but I'll try to be as efficient as possible. But Julie, thanks for that great introduction. And again, yeah, my name is Matt Palumbo. I'm the non-game bird migratory biologist for the New York State DEC, based out of the central office in Albany, and help coordinate a wide variety of non-game bird projects across the state, involved in some research and monitoring for several different species and groups. And Julie gave a really good preamble in terms of sort of the background of where the DEC was with monitoring nightjars and sort of where we came to with things today. I'll provide a little bit more context to that as well in the presentation. And so to not waste any more time, I think we'll probably just jump right into that, hopefully.
And Matt, do you want people to ask questions mostly on chat, or do you want people to unmute themselves and ask, or wait till the end? What would you prefer?
I guess if you have questions during the presentation, you could enter them in the chat, and then if we can get to them at the end, and then at the end, if there's other questions, you can just vocally say them, and we'll get to them then as well.
Perfect. Thanks.
Thanks. Great. So again, thanks everybody for being here tonight. I really appreciate it. And I do definitely want to acknowledge my co-presenter here, Julie Hart. She's been a leading and driving force behind a lot of this collaborative effort and has been providing a lot of the resources that we'll be talking about today and doing a lot of the behind the scenes work that is really the driving force behind this effort. So I really appreciate her help and for her keeping me honest throughout this process as well of the presentation and helping me out with my technological difficulties. With that, I'd also like to acknowledge Matt Schlesinger and Kathy Schneider. They were involved with the planning and the review and a bunch of the data organization that went into this as well. So greatly appreciate their help on the project as well. It's definitely appreciated. So general overview today is hopefully just be sort of two parts. First half, I'll give an overview of what was in the 2021 handbook. That'll be sort of the framework of what I'll be talking about for things. and then primarily open it up for questions. If there's things that I haven't covered or hit on, then open up the room for folks to talk about any questions they have in terms of methodology or species ID as well. But primarily what I'll be focusing on in terms of the presentation is just logistics of how to do the survey itself. And if you have questions in terms of birding tips or stuff like that, we have time afterwards, we can definitely talk about that as well. So as a reminder, all the information that we'll be talking about here today can be found on the Ebird blog page, where the handbook can be found, all the spatial information, all the data forms. There's all hyperlinks on this website here that you can copy and use to get to all the information that we'll be talking about here today. So as a quick introduction, I'm sure many folks on the call are aware, but since the 1970s, a lot of bird species have been in a dramatic decline across North America. The very popular paper and very seminal paper that's coming out of Cornell that's documented over or close to 3 billion birds that have been lost since 1970 altogether. So over that great concern of a loss of many bird species or bird abundance, of those, the guild that we're going to be focusing on are aerial insectivores. And of that, there's been up to 160 million of these individuals lost, or a decline in about 32% of this guild altogether. So drilling down into this guild a little bit further, we're going to be focusing, or the foundation of this is focusing really on nightjars themselves. And within nightjars, the species we'll be focusing on in New York are these three here: the Chuck-Will's widow, the common nighthawk, and the eastern whippoorwill. With that, to give an idea of some of the previous efforts that have gone into monitoring the species, the classic one that most everybody's involved with right now is the third BBA. But to see changes in distribution of these species across the state from the first BBA and the second BBA, you can see here for Chuck-Will's widow, the occurrences down mainly on Long Island, where they were first documented in the 80s in 21 blocks that decreased to 8. And this is just about a percent decline of roughly 62%. For common nighthawk, they were a little bit more statewide spread in the 80s, it being observed in 477 blocks. This decreased to 138, which is a large decline of about 71% of these total blocks across the entire state of New York. Then for eastern whippoorwill, they were observed in 564 blocks. This had a pretty staggering decrease to 241 blocks altogether. And this was just over 57% decrease in total coverage for across the state. So due to this decline in nightjars, not only in New York, but across a lot of their range, there's other efforts that have been going on, which I'm sure many folks have been involved with, monitoring this group of birds as well. And this would be the Nightjar Survey Network that's based out of the Center for Conservation Biology. And a lot of the methodology that we used in the past and that we'll be talking about tonight, and it's in the handbook, is based off of the methodology that's used from the Nightjar Survey Network. And then we're also augmenting it to boost some BBA observations as well. So it's a bit of an adaptation to what the Nightjar Survey Network has been using classically. So a little history of what the DEC has been doing. So we have been monitoring roughly about 19 routes per year up until last year that Julie mentioned, where we really had a lot of logistical constraints to get out and keep up with these, with surveying these routes. And these routes were based off of the last really known confirmed locations in the Breeding Bird Atlas, some observations from the Breeding Bird Survey, and where people observed birds during woodcock surveys as well. You can, if you remember where that distribution from the BBA slides were, these green dots sort of represent those last locations, or a sample of those last locations across the state. And we've been monitoring those sites since roughly about 2013, 2014 or so. But as Julie mentioned, we've come into several logistical constraints of keeping this up, and we're hoping to really capitalize on citizen science and the volunteer base to continue monitoring these locations and then expand effort across the state as well. So with that, the objectives that we're trying to accomplish are one, primarily that the foundation of this is to monitor the breeding distribution of nightjars in New York. And then, as I mentioned, since we'll be out there monitoring nightjars, we're also trying to target crepuscular and nocturnal breeding observations to boost those observations for the breeding bird atlas, as those can be somewhat more challenging to come across in typical birding outings. So we're trying to target those late in the evening and into the night observations as well. So to get into a bit of the methodology and what we are proposing or asking people to do, first we'll talk about the surveys in general. So we're asking for one sunset survey, and this is targeting your common nighthawks and your various other crepuscular species. Then one moonrise survey, and this would target eastern whippoorwill and the chuckwill's widows for the nightjars, and then the other nocturnal bird species that may be calling or observed at that time as well. So both of these surveys we're asking to do during 2 survey windows. So the first survey window is May 19th to June 2nd and June 17th to July 1st. So overall, best case scenario, we're asking for 4 surveys, a sunset and moonrise survey in both survey windows. If you have to prioritize, we're asking you to prioritize to go out during that first survey window. And then also, if you do have observations in that first survey window, we're really emphasizing if you can go back in the second survey window and survey again. But as I mentioned, best case scenario, total of 4 surveys in both survey windows. So where to go to survey? As I mentioned a few slides prior, there were some historical, I guess call it that, DEC routes. And you can find the location of these routes and the points either by downloading the coordinates from the link in the handbook, or on an Ebird blog page. You can see this map specifically. And this is a Google map where each one of these purple dots is a point associated with each one of the routes. And if you were to zoom in on one of the routes, such as this one here, you could click on one of the points. So like this point here where my pointer is one I clicked on. It sort of has a white halo around it. And what it would bring up then is the route name, the route stop, and the GPS coordinates for each one of those routes. So if there's a survey route near you that you want to try and survey that's already been established, you are more than welcome and encouraged to try and survey those historical or pre-established routes that are out there as well. Additionally, we're hoping to really key in on people creating their own routes and using a lot of prior observations or the information that everybody sort of has that we might not be aware of, or the ability to get to a lot of these places as well. So if you know where there's good or where you've observed nightjars in the past, we encourage you to try to make a route around that location, or that would represent that location. So first tip to probably do that would be try to find areas where there's good habitat. So good habitat being areas such as pine barrens or along field edges. So the idea being here of where there's like a forest opening on those full moon nights. For example, whippoorwills would be on the forest edges and feeding on insects that are backlit along the full moon that's exposed there. Or gravel pits. That's a common spot to find nightjars as well, sort of doing that same type of behavior, and you could observe them calling in these locations as well. So if you don't have prior observations or not too sure where good habitat might be, we've provided eBird observations from the past 5 years to be a bit of a guide as to where to go across the state. So again, you could download these from the link in the handbook or the eBird page, and there's a Google map on the eBird page. If you download these and you open them, they would just open as a KMZ file, something like Google Earth. You could look at through that. But on the Google map and the eBird page, what you would see is something like this. So there's each one of the different species is a different color. And what this represents are observations that have been filtered to have been recorded within the past 5 years for the 3 different species. So for example, if I zoomed in here, you would, it might be hard to see, but like I clicked on this one, there's the white halo around it. It would give you the species that observation was, the GPS point, and the number of observations that were recorded there, and then the number of years within the past 5 years birds were observed. So the idea would be that this could guide you to a general area where then you could create a route that would encapsulate these prior observations so that you're not just sort of going out without any idea of where to really go across the state to set up your own route if you wanted to. So with that, if you're going to set up your own route, what you'd want to do is the route itself would be 10 stops. Each point should be spaced a mile apart from the other stop. So it's sort of an important nuance. This is an example of what it would look like if you downloaded the points and brought it up in Google Earth. This is just part of a survey route, not the entire route. But if you notice, if the road snakes back on itself, you might have traveled a mile as you're driving, but the next point might actually be within a mile of the previous point. So it's important that the points are spaced out a mile from one another, irrespective of how far you've driven. Whatever route you set up, or if you survey one of the established routes, start at stop number 1. And in terms of finding the best spot to pull off the road, your safety is paramount no matter what. So make sure you're in a safe spot. And in terms of wiggle room around those points, if you're plus or minus 0.2 miles around an existing coordinate or the coordinate point that you set up for your route, that's okay. That's sort of the give or take area that we're asking for. And then for new routes, we're asking that folks use the location data sheet that can be found in the handbook. And what this looks like is this sheet here, provide or ask some information about who you are, phone number, contact information, and then the coordinates for where the location of the points are in decimal degrees, and also recording of the number of buildings around to get an idea of how much noise might be around there as well. But one thing that's really important, whether you do an established route, create your own route, whatever way you go, highly stress that you go out during the day ahead of time and record your locations and get sort of a dry run through your survey route to get a good idea of pull-off spots, where to be safe, familiar with turns, just become familiar with where you're going, and you're not doing that in the dark. So with that being the idea of where to go, the next part would be when to go out and survey. So with that, as I mentioned, there's 2 survey windows. The first window is May 19th to June 2nd. And essentially in the center of that survey window on May 26th is the full moon. So both these windows revolve around when the full moon is right at the center of the timing period. So the waxing moon would be that first half before it's completely full, May 19th to May 26th. And the second half would be May 27th to June 2nd. And the same idea would then be for the second survey window when the next full moon would be around, and that full moon would be June 24th. So with that, with the sunset survey, we're asking folks to go 45 minutes before to 45 minutes after sunset to capture those crepuscular species that would be observed at that time. For moonrise surveys, this would be 15 minutes after sunset. So the moon should be above the horizon and it should be visible. That's a key part for the moonrise survey. And that you survey no later than 15 minutes before sunrise. So if you're going during that second window, late in the survey period, you might be out there at the very early part of the morning, but you want to make sure you're finished with your survey at least 15 minutes before sunrise. And the idea being that your survey should take about an hour and a half to complete altogether. So you can run a sunset survey and then a moonrise survey right back to back, but the idea would be that then you would come back in the second window and do those two again as well. It all depends on timing and when moonrise and sunset is for when you decide to go out. So in terms of when to go out, time of year, time of day, also certain conditions. So for the sunset survey, the wind cannot be anything greater than 3 on the Beaufort scale. If you're not familiar with that, in the handbook, there's some miles per hour guidance. There's some sort of environmental indicators of what smoke would look like, a flag moving, leaves rustling, to get an idea of what that wind speed is. And then essentially any precipitation, drizzle, rain, or snow, you don't want to go out there as well. Moonrise survey, similar idea in terms of environmental conditions, but also it's just key for this one that the moon is not obscured, for greater than 3 stops. So the key thing is that you can see the moon really. So stuff that you'll need while you're out there, data sheets, clipboard, the survey protocol, route map coordinates, flashlight headlamp, stopwatch, timer, pens, pencils, smartphone. Encourage you to bring a survey buddy to go with you, help carry some of this stuff, juggle writing down notes and keeping time. But for observations, it should be one person doing, doing the observations. So with that being the when to go, what to bring, next would be what to record. So there's 2 different survey forms. They look identical other than the heading, essentially. So there's one for the sunset bird survey form, and then the next one is this moonrise survey form. And we'll go through this one a little bit more in detail, but they're the same thing other than the heading. So first chunk up here is just information about the route name. So if you have an established route, it already has a name. If you create a route, you can name it. Ideally, you name it something about like the village or town or something close by to get an idea of sort of where you are in the state. The observer, who you are observing, the date you went out, the start time of when the whole survey started, end time for when the whole survey finished. Excuse me. And then survey conditions is the next block. And there's a key up at the top right of the data sheet as well. So these are recordings for each survey point. So you have the start time of the survey point, the wind speed. These are all coded for 1 through 5. The sky code, again, coded 0 through 6. Or sorry, wind was 0 through 5 as well. The noise, what type of background noise might be going on out there, 0 through 3. Cars, the number of cars that you observe during each survey point. The idea is not to be counting cars. It's not the whole focus, but if you get to a lot, such as 15, just put plus 15. We just know there's a lot of cars. And then the temperature at each survey point, if you can record this. So a good way to do this is if you have a temperature gauge on your car, just take the temperature once you get to each survey point. The next then would be the information at each survey point. So you have the stop, the species that are observed, the survey minute. So at each survey point, you're surveying for 6 minutes, and each minute is its own individual survey segment. We'll get into that a little bit more in a second. Whether or not the bird moved and the direction you first heard the bird, if it did move, if it didn't move, then that's fine, it stays the same. And then the breeding code, and this would be your breeding code that would be similar to any other BBA observation that you would be putting into the portal or into Ebird. And there's a table of these in the handbook as well for what the breeding codes would be. Primarily, a lot of them are going to be singing because it's half of the surveys are nighttime surveys as well. Comments, you could write comments down here and then also put that on the back as well. And then directions on where to send the information. Okay, so to go through this, we'll walk you through sort of one survey point and what that would look like is an example for data collection. So if we got to a survey route and we're at point 1 here and we're all ready to go, get all the environmental conditions written down, and we're ready to start the clock to start observing and recording individuals. So we got our 1-minute timer, hit the timer, away we go. So with that, we then get down to 15 seconds left in the first minute, and we have a whippoorwill calling that's in the northeasterly direction. So with that, we write down the alpha code in the species section there. So you can put the alpha code, you can put the full bird name or an abbreviation, but if you use an abbreviation, please make it very obvious what bird you're using. Alpha code, if you're familiar with those, is probably the easiest thing to do. But a thing to note there is that in the first survey minute, then we recorded an X and the direction the bird was observed to the northeast. So one thing to stress is that in all these observation boxes, it's just going to be X's and O's. There's going to be no numbers. And what this looks like is that this first individual is on the first line. So all observations to this individual goes to the first line. So we made it through the first minute. We're on to the second minute. Get to 30 seconds. We hear the same whippoorwill, and it's the same bird. So we get another X in the second survey minute for that individual, and it all stays on the same line. We get to the third survey minute, start that minute. We get down to 30 seconds. This whippoorwill is quite vocal, calls again, and it's the same one. So we get an X at the 3-minute mark for that individual. But then at 15-second mark, we hear another whippoorwill call from the south. So now what happens? We have another individual. Another individual gets its own separate line. So the key part of this is that each line is an individual bird. So this bird to the south was never observed during the first and second minute. So those cells in this data sheet get O's, and an X now is in the 3rd minute block because that's when it called. And we also filled in the direction of which it came from to the south. Go to the next survey minute. So we're in survey minute 4 here. At 30 seconds, we hear a bird calling to the south, another whippoorwill, and it is the same one again. So the same one gets an X in the 4th survey minute. At 15 seconds, our bird to the northeast won't be outshone. So it calls again, and it's the same individual up here as well. So in that survey minute, gets another X. 5th survey minute, get down to 30 seconds. Bird to the northeast calls again, same bird. So we get another X in minute 5 for that individual on the first line. 15 seconds hits, bird to the south calls, same bird again. So we get an X for that individual in minute 5. Minute 6, get down to 30 seconds. That bird in the northeast calls again, same individual. So the first line gets an X then in minute 6. We get all the way back to the end of that time period. Bird to the south never called again. No other birds ever called. So that bird gets an O. Then for minute 6, none of them moved, and all the breeding codes were singing because we all heard them auditorily. So what this would look like then for the rest of, or the next few survey points. So we moved to the second survey point, didn't hear anything, just wrote in none. Survey point 3, so we had a whippoorwill call from the west in the first 3 time minutes. After that, never called again, got a singing code. Another whippoorwill called from the southwest at minutes 4, 5, and 6. And it did move, but its original spot was to the southwest, gets a singing code. A common nighthawk, we heard booming in minute 5. So it was from the southwest, and since this was a courtship display, it gets a C in the breeding code. And then another whippoorwill was heard minute 5 and 6 to the north. So overall at point 3, there's 3 whippoorwills that called and 1 common nighthawk that was observed. Survey point 4, there's a barred owl that called during the first 3 survey minutes, and then a whippoorwill in the last 3 survey minutes. so on and so forth. Hopefully everybody picks up on sort of the pattern that is laid out there. So once you collect this information, we're asking you to submit it. So the hard copy of the data sheets to be scanned and emailed to this email address here. On the bottom of the survey forms, it sort of tells you what to put in the subject line to put into this email address. And we're also asking you to submit your observations to Ebird, either through the Ebird app, through the portal while you're out in the field, or if you want to record your observations and do it later on, do it at the Ebird Atlas Submit website here as well. So with that, if you have any questions before you go out there, while you go out there, anything along the way, please send them to Julie and I. If you have specific like Ebird type questions, Julie's the guru with that and really be the best person to talk to. But with that, that's sort of the rundown of the handbook. Again, apologize for being late, so I ate into some question time, but more than happy to stay a little bit later to help anything out with that. But that's all we have for the presentation, and open it up for questions. I couldn't really see the chat, so I didn't know if stuff was coming in or not.
Yeah, I've been trying to keep up with the chat as it's been coming in. Been quite active with lots of questions. Before we dive into that, there was one other thing that I wanted to touch on real quick. Just a couple of tips for when you're actually in the field. So I think that for whippoorwill and chuckwill's widow, most people can probably identify them pretty well because they're going to say their name. So, you know, chuckwill's widow or whippoorwill, right? So you've got those two species are pretty easy to ID because they're saying their name. The one that's a little bit harder is the common nighthawk. And the common nighthawks are going to make two different sounds. There's two different sounds you might hear. One of them will be the booming sound, and this is the sound they make when they're in flight and they kind of like make a dive and they rush really quickly, and the air moves really quickly over their wings, over some really modified wing feathers, and it makes this booming sound. It's like brrr sound that's really loud. And then the other sound that they're going to make is a peent sound. So if you're familiar with the painting of woodcock, it sounds very similar to a woodcock, but a woodcock only paints from the ground and a nighthawk paints from the air. So that's a good way to tell which one of those species it is. So that's my 2-minute spiel on how to identify the three target species that we're after. But somebody asked a good question. Are we recording all of the species that you hear? And yeah, if you know whatever species you can identify, then please report them and track those as well. That's a really great way to help us fill in a lot of gaps for the breeding bird atlas. So
I see one question. Thanks, Matt, for posting that link, and nice to finally meet you. But there's a question of last year, somebody tried to root in one of the state parks and the park closed at sunset if there's any way to get access. I believe we may have removed that route specifically due to some access difficulties that are there, and it'll hopefully be covered by some of the state folks that will be going out there and that have permission to get access to those areas. So if there is any reason in terms of access or anything like that, yeah, not looking for anybody to go beyond anything that would be available to just the public.
I think I might give a short little demo real quick to answer Justin's question. I just want to show really quickly how to use the Google map. All right, can you see my screen with the Nightjar post on the website?
Yep.
Perfect. So let me make it a tiny bit bigger if I can. Nope, sorry. It's me pretending again that this Windows is a Mac. So if you scroll down here, I embedded a Google map. We created a Google map that should help guide you. So I embedded a Google map in here. If you click on in the top right corner, it'll show view larger map. So that'll take you straight to the Google map and it'll fill your whole screen. And so once you have the full map here, you can zoom into whichever area you're interested in. And Justin asked about Long Island, Nighthawks, I believe. So you can also, in the left-hand side here, you can turn off whatever ones you want. I did make sure that each species had its own icon so that you could easily tell them apart when you had all of them visible at the same time. But you can turn off all of them except for the species that you're interested in, for example. So it looks like there are a few. So yeah, Fire Island is good. You know, there's a couple of points. There's another one out here in the western part, and a few around New York City. I'm not sure. One of the things that we had a hard time with was weeding out some of the sightings that are in Ebird from where we actually think that they're breeding rather than, like, say, a late migrant. So we did our best to weed them out, but this is what we're left with, and we're not actually sure if they're breeding at these places. So that's one of the reasons we ask people to go back a second time if you detect one of the nightjars on your first visit. If you go back a second time, then if you're familiar with atlasing, you can bump that code up, right, from a singing to an S7 code the next time you go, and that gives us a little bit more confidence that they're actually breeding locally at that location rather than potentially a late migrant.
Thank
So
you.
yeah.
Could you post the Google Maps link? I'm having trouble finding it on your website.
Yep, I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you very much.
And again, it's just on this blog post page here.
Oh, I was on last year's page. Thank you.
Okay, yep.
Can I ask a question? Part question, part statement, probably. Apologies for that. So in the chat, when Matt was speaking, somebody asked about whether you could do visual observations and or auditory observations. And Julie, you said it should be auditory observations. So with Nighthawks, I feel like the first survey window is kind of prime Nighthawk migration period in New York. And my experience is that they tend to be not vocal and definitely not displaying when they're migrating. Sometimes I feel like they might call, but I feel like they're generally quiet. So if you just see a Nighthawk, would you not put it on the survey form at all?
Matt, do you want to answer?
So again,
You want me to answer?
No, yeah, we're waiting for each other. So if you just see a Nighthawk, what we're asking is that you make note of it in the comments in terms of the visual observations and any information relating to that visual observation, and then also enter that into your Ebird observations. But in terms of the cells and the minute blocks and the actual, like, individuals that would be at point 1, at point 2, those would just be for the auditory observations.
Okay.
Cindy asked a good question. Do we know good dates for breeding versus migrating. So for the first window that starts in a week, next Wednesday, whippoorwills and chuckwill's widow should be within their breeding period by that time. So any of the whips or the chucks that you're getting should be local breeders. Nighthawks, it could be either. Some will be still migrating through, some might be on their territory already. So that's partly why we're asking people to go twice. I can also offer, so I've done a number of these surveys in other states. So I have some experience with actually carrying them out myself. And if it's possible for you, I do recommend having somebody go with you, partner with you. And that way they can, so you have one person who's going to be doing, like, actually have the data sheet in front of them and entering the data and you know, hearing things and writing stuff down on the data sheet. But the other person could at the same time be helping you keep track of those 1 minute intervals. And they could also be looking over your shoulder and doing the Ebird checklist for you on their mobile phone at the same time. If you're just doing it by yourself, then what I've found, what I usually do is I set a 1 minute timer on my phone, and then I just keep restarting it every minute until I get those 6 1 minute periods are over. And then I will just enter my Ebird checklist when I get home. So those are kind of the practical tips that I can offer. And I do recommend, you know, trying to brush up a little bit on some of the other nocturnal calls you might be hearing. I think it often, or at least for me, when the few times I've gone out, it's surprising what species are actually calling in the middle of the night. You know, ovenbirds and red-eyed vireos, and you know, you'll hear ducks calling and all kinds of things. Not to mention all of the frogs and some mammals as well. So there is a list of species. I included a list at the end of the handbook of other species that you're likely to encounter, so you can you know, refresh on some of those other sounds if you're wanting to.
Yeah, it's also a good time to sometimes confirm or at least detect owls' fledglings. Fledglings give distinctive calls, and the May-June period is a good time to get fledgling great horns and bards, and if you're lucky, long-eared.
Yeah, very good. There's a couple questions in the chat. I can answer those real quick. Ajit asked if the Ebird checklist is for each stop, or you know, how many do you do? Yeah, I would do each stop. So I would just do a 6 minute stationary count at each point. And then that way you also don't have to worry about block boundaries at all. So then it's much easier, and you can just put everything from that 6 minutes into that one checklist. And again, using the highest breeding code that you observe. So the one thing I didn't mention before is that the whippoorwill and the chuckwill's widow, if you hear them giving their typical song, that you can record as song. And then for nighthawks, the booming is actually courtship. So that you would mark as courtship. And then let's see, Andrea asked about the sunset and the moonrise surveys on the same night. So yeah, you can combine the two, although you're not going to get moonrise before sunset.
Yeah,
I mean, well,
so
depending on how you cut the day in two.
yeah,
But yeah, so I think one other thing that I will mention, it's easiest to do the survey if you would rather be up at night than getting up at 3 in the morning. Do it in the first half of the survey. So when the moon is waxing, that's when you're going to have sunset, and then moonrise will be shortly after it gets dark. So I tend to find that part of the window to be easier to get the survey done. It depends on when you would rather be up.
and in that time frame, the recommendation is to do the moonrise survey at least 15 minutes after sunset.
Did everyone catch that? It's a little choppy. Can you say that again, Matt?
Sorry, I didn't realize I wasn't coming through. So for the moonrise survey, if you're doing it right after the sunset survey, the recommendation is to do it at least 15 minutes after sunset.
It's also worth noting, I forget the specifics. I think I should know this, but sometimes during the survey window, the moon isn't up at 9 o'clock, which is kind of like when I would normally go out for whippoorwill. Sometimes you need to wait maybe until 10 o'clock or something for the moon to be above the horizon.
I guess it's worth mentioning too that the reason why the moon has to be up is because that really does affect how often these birds vocalize. And so if it's possible to do the route when there are some clouds, but you'll find that if you're on a completely cloudless night and it's, the moon is really lighting up the sky, these birds are going to be much more vocal. So that's why it's after the moon has risen, when you can see it, when it's not obscured by clouds. That's really going to optimize when you're likely to encounter these birds. Temperature also can have an effect, but hopefully by mid-May we're getting a little warmer. We'll see next week. Let's see, I'm reading through the chat here real quick. It's like Will is asking about Madison County. Oh, Ajit has a different website to go to. I always use Date and Time, I think is the name of the website. What Date and Time? Anyways, I link to it in the blog article and also in the handbook. There's a link to another website that tells you exactly what time moonrise is and sunset is and all of that. And then it'll give it to you just based on your actual location. So that's a really helpful website. Yeah, definitely contact Matt or I, and I'll just put my email there. And Matt Medler, you responded to Will about Oneida Lake, it looks like.
Yeah, I was just saying that in general, I would look for spots like Matt Palumbo said, with like a mix of forest and field. But the kind of classic spots in central New York are north side of Oneida Lake, associated with the gravel pits. I don't know if there are any of those down in Madison County or not. Yeah, it's tough. It's tough here in central New York. There are places that superficially look like places where I get them up in northern New York, and I've never had a breeding season whippoorwill in central New York, and I've been here like 20 years. But don't let that discourage you. Get out there, and even if you don't hear a whippoorwill, there's always cool stuff to hear. You'll hear owls, like Julie said. Ovenbirds do flight songs all the time. You never know what you might find. Cuckoos, black-billed cuckoos are quite vocal at night, so it's fun. Yeah, thank you.
Suzanne asked a really good question of how do we make sure many of us aren't doing the same route? So it's a great question, great observation. There is no fail-safe in terms of doing that. There will be multiple people running multiple routes, especially the pre-established routes. So do take that into consideration that you might run into somebody else who is out there. If you create your own route, there's probably not the chance of somebody doing the same exact route, but there might be somebody in the general area if it's based off of Ebird observations or something like that. And in terms of sampling design and repeat observations and multiple people sampling the same spots, it's totally fine. It provides more observations, will get us more coverage that's out there, and we will sort of filter through that and work through that on the back end of things. The key thing is just making sure you're recording where you are surveying, so we know where everything is in relation to everything else.
It's actually really good for statistics to have those repeat observations. So, Cindy asked if people do these by car or on foot. Traditionally, these are mostly done by car just because it's a big distance between each point and you're at night. It's a little safer. However, I will say, I don't know where you're located, Cindy. But there are some surveys like the Albany Pine Bush, they actually do foot surveys. You can be a volunteer there and do in Hamilton County. Okay, so there are some places that do foot surveys. I do think car surveys are a little bit safer because you're at night and you're going to have, your car to stand behind and protect you from any traffic. I will say also that, one thing that we have expanded this survey from last year in terms of adding in this whole component of the sunset surveys to try to target nighthawks, which have been traditionally overlooked by these surveys. And then the one thing that we're still not encapsulating are those rooftop nesting nighthawks. So historically, there have been nighthawks nesting on flat roofs with rocks on top of the roof. However, a lot of those rooftops have disappeared recently. And we're not really sure how many rooftop nesting pairs are left in the state. But that's something hopefully we'll be able to address next year. And my inclination right now is that those urban routes those might be walking routes because it would be easier to get around and actually detect the birds that way, but not set in stone.
And in the meantime, people who live in urban settings can do eBird stationary counts right in the city and see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely harder in those urban settings to be able to hear above traffic noise and that kind of stuff. But yeah.
So one of the questions that I saw was how short can a route be? So in terms of consistency across the state, we're shooting for people to do 10 survey points. So the goal should be 10 points spaced a mile apart, and that will really help in terms of a bit of standardization across the state in terms of the amount of effort that people are putting out there per route. And if you have certain spots that you think are better than others, keep in mind that there is multiple components and objectives to this. So if you have a few that are really good whippoorwill spots or nightjar spots and the others you're not too keen on for that, you can be also providing a lot of crepuscular and nocturnal observations for other species as well that are out there. So shoot for 10 points spaced a mile apart. I'll
add that when the route that I used to do when I lived in Vermont, I had there were 10 points, and the first 9 of them were along the road, and then I would park at a big earthen dam, and I would have to walk a mile to the last point. So if you can combine, like, you know, I think somebody also mentioned a gravel pit or an airport where you have to walk in, as well as the state forest. You could potentially do, you know, 8 or 9 points around the area, and then end up at the end where you're walking into that last point, or 2. That's another option.
And Sydney asked, it's a mile as the crow flies. Yes, so it's a mile in terms of the point to the next point. You might have to drive 2 miles around and who knows what to get to that point, but you want to make sure that it didn't bring you back to like a quarter mile next to the last point you actually just surveyed. You want to make sure that the points are at least are a mile apart. So it takes some planning for sure to lay it out.
And I guess if you are lucky and live in a part of the state where there's more than one species in the area, you know, you could always try to be really creative and make a route that might hit multiple species. That would be really cool. Any last questions?
I don't have a question. I just have a comment. One of the birders here in Buffalo who took part in the last birding atlas survey, he sort of gave a tip. He said to wear like one of those safety vests that people wear, and have a clipboard. He said this way you look more official and less suspicious. Apparently he was harassed quite a few times last time when he birded. He was on property, even though he had permission to be on the property. You know, people thought he was a robber or an intruder. So I thought that was a good tip that I wanted to share.
Yeah, that is a good point. When I've done the surveys in the past, I've always also kept like a letter with me saying, like, you know, I'm doing this as part of this survey. And I'm just thinking, we have a landowner letter, like an introductory letter for if you go to approach a landowner. And I'm not sure if that would double well in this case or not.
I have sort of a package. I have the landowner letter, and I have the list for the different for my blog, like with a logo, and I got the tote with the logo, and I have the magnet for my car, and I have I have printed out the little thing that goes on the dashboard, so I have all of those in my car, just, you know, to make it more official. I haven't been out. I live in the city of Buffalo, so I have my blog here. So I haven't really needed it yet, but I thought I'd be prepared just in case somebody wonders what I'm doing.
Those are good tips.
Yeah, that's great.
Does the guide in the handbook have kind of other safety tips, or do you have any worth sharing here now in terms of like where to park, not park, leaving some lights on, that sort of stuff? Is that in there?
We don't have leaving lights on. We do strongly recommend that you scout the route in the daytime ahead of time so that you know where it will be safe to pull off the road. And you can, you know, fudge the location of the exact point where you're stopping, you know, plus or minus 0.2 miles. And so definitely use that if you need to, so that you're safely off the road. You're not parked right in front of a house. You think you're going to be in a quiet location. Yeah, I would wear a vest, have a headlamp just in case, and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
I always try to avoid like sharp turns where a car coming around the corner might not see your car until the last minute, and also any steep hills where visibility is an issue too.
Absolutely.
That's a great tip, Adrian. Great. Well, I think we'll wrap up because we've already gone a bit over. I did take a recording, and I will post this also recording on our YouTube channel. So if you know somebody else who missed it and wants to check it out, let them know. And then, yeah, any questions you have, shoot me an email and Matt an email, and we'll get back to you really quickly. And I think the most important thing is to try to have fun.
Yeah, thanks everybody for your interest and your participation in the training, and I'm looking forward to seeing how this all works out. I'm really excited about it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks everybody.